Hello and happy Tuesday, everyone. Welcome to this week's Industry Insights. My name is Leah Troscianecki. I am your Principal Product Marketing Manager here at Veeam, and I am joined today by one of my other fantastic hosts, Jason Buffington. Hi, Jason.
Hello, hello, hello.
Absolutely. And Jason and I will both be in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, celebrating with our Veeam community at VeeamON 2024. We really hope you have a chance to join us in person. Jason and I will both be presenting. We'll both be walking around the floor. You will probably find both of us at the bar at some point. So we would love to see you in person. If not, we also have some of the great content available on our online platform for free. So if you can't join us in person, please go ahead and join us online. We really would love to chat with you. And one of the things we're going to be doing is actually broadcasting industry insights live from the show floor. So we will post days and times for that in the weeks ahead. Stay tuned. We hope to see you there as well. But today we are going to be talking about one of Jason and I's favorite topics to talk about. We have been talking about this topic for nigh on a decade specifically, and it is going to be all about BaaS and DRaaS, all about that BaaS, that BaaS. That's a fun joke for those of you who know the Meghan Trainor song, all about that bass. So specifically, we're going to be talking about why organizations are interested in BaaS and or DRaaS. We're going to end with DRaaS today. So that's a good spoiler for you guys who may be interested in soaking up all the goodness from our Veeam community, but especially our Veeam service provider partners. So to kick us off, we wanted to talk a bit about what the landscape is today for organizations evaluating their current data protection strategies. And certainly over the years, we've seen a lot of organizations make some pretty big changes to their approach to data protection. And Jason, I think in this year's Data Protection Trends Report, which is again, the largest independent research that we do at this company. We really want to hear from organizations, regardless of if they're Veeam users or not, with this research. And we continue to see a trend that's super important, which is a desire to change their strategy and oftentimes change their solution provider or even their service provider. So Jason, you want to talk to us a little bit about that trend and what we're seeing for 2024?
Yeah, if you haven't checked out the Data Protection Trends Report yet, this publishes every year. Every year, Veeam goes out and we use independent research panel companies. They go and vet for, in this case, IT leaders responsible for the data protection strategies and methodologies of their organization. So it's a blind survey. These are not Veeam customers. And so some of the questions that get asked this year is, why would you change and things like that. And a high emphasis on interest in improving reliability, high emphasis in things like protecting more modern workloads like those that are cloudy. We're going to cover more on that as this series unfolds. But one of the more interesting statistics that we've been seeing over the last couple of years is interest to change. So what you're looking at here, the question was, what's the likelihood your organization will change its primary backup solution or service over the next 12 months. Now, I think it's important that when you look at this, but punchline, by the way, 54%, slightly over half of all organizations intend to or anticipate changing their primary solution or service. I'm going to go ahead and be an optimist and say, look, there's also 19% that are undecided, right? At the time of the survey, they didn't know. So you could presume that arguably that gets up to 73% ish along the way. So 3 out of 4. Here's the way you should think about it. This survey published in early January of 2024. So I'm not going to tell you that by December 31st of 2024, 74% will have change. Take the tech out of it. Think about it this way. If I asked you the question, what's the likelihood that you might look at a new car this year, right? What the data says is at least 54% of folks will walk into a car dealership this year. Not every one of them is going to buy, right? Some of them are going to find that what they have actually works better. Others are going to realize that maybe they can't afford it, right? There's all kinds of reasons, but 54% are going to make the effort to go into a dealership and look at what's out there with the intent to change. 19% haven't decided yet, but if they're driving by a dealership on a Saturday afternoon, it's a pretty day out, hey, why don't we turn right? Why don't we go look and see what they got? And by the way, the 27%, That doesn't mean 27% of folks are saying, I love my backup solution. Of course, I'm not going to change. What it means is they don't anticipate change, but they haven't anticipated ransomware yet, or some of the other major crises that are out there that might actually drive that behavior change later. Anyway, my point is there's a huge interest in changing the primary solution overall. I'm going to also point out there's two cute little blue numbers on the side that also comes out of the data protection trends research. One of them says 92% of organizations have more budget for backup in 2024 than they did in 23. So it's always fun to go to the dealership when you know you got a little bit of extra money coming in, right? Maybe that monthly payment could be just a little bit higher. And speaking of, on average, it could be about 6.5% higher, right? So organizations said that their data protection budget for 2024 is about 6.6% greater than it was last year. I think that's interesting because IDC and Gartner both say 3.5% to 4% is overall spend. So if cost of living is up 3%, but you got a raise of 6.6, you're doing pretty well for 2024. And by the way, that's not all of us. So with all that in mind, interest in change, a little bit more budget, higher disposition, I think this is an interesting topic to talk about. But Leah, I'm going to anticipate your next question, which is, what do you think they're going to change to? Let's talk about that, because one of the other questions in DPR, which sets us up for today, is what's the likelihood that your organization will utilize backup as a service, BaaS, or disaster recovery as a service, DRaaS, for any of your servers over the next 2 years? 88%. 7 out of 8 organizations anticipate leveraging BaaS or DRaaS as part of their solution. Leah, knowing you and my having a shared passion in this area, does this surprise you? Does this excite you? Let's talk about it.
Absolutely. I think when you go back to that 6.6 number, that's the number that I think is really the key here to understanding the trend. When we look at, again, those budgets, this is definitely a delta above average IT spend. And part of that, we think as members of this category, is that it's becoming an imperative to upgrade your environments in order to stay resilient, right? To stay ahead of the kinds of outage threats that so many organizations are experiencing. And it continues to show the imperative that data availability is more important than ever before. And so understanding that can illuminate the kind of reasons why someone may look for services, because this does seem to be an increasing trend, going from maybe a software-only solution or an appliance-based stack that was kind of pre-installed many, many, many years ago, and you haven't thought about it since. Well, the interesting thing now is these sorts of threat actors are smarter. They're adapting, and our data protection solutions need to adapt with it. But with that threat of feeling like you're constantly behind the 8 ball comes the desire to leverage shared expertise and shared resources, right? And that's where services come in. And you're starting to see so many more as a service models, not just in the data protection space, but also in many other categories. It's not just about managing the underlying infrastructure. It's about staying up to date, keeping up with continuous versions, right? Being able to implement the latest enhancements immediately without any kind of backlog of, oh, well, we'll do that later. And let's maybe look at that over a weekend or over a holiday or in 2 years. It just really keeps you up to date. And I think that's so much of why it's really exciting.
I think you kind of got ahead on my deck because there's more stuff on this that I think you just summarized. But let's roll back that tape a few minutes and talk about that, because you've kind of made some inferences as far as, okay, why are all those reasons? So let's talk about that for a minute. So one of the things we're super excited about is that we're publishing the Cloud Protection Trends latest edition of this. DPR comes out, Data Protection Trends Report, comes out every year in the January-ish timeframe. We use that as a way to kind of restart some fresh conversations and also track things like budgets and how the year has turned out and that kind of thing. But one of the reports we published more like every 18 months or so is our Cloud Protection Trends Report. And one of the questions, and I love how you've gotten us into this part of the conversation, is, okay, so what does that actually mean to do services as it relates to backup? And so that's one of the questions we fundamentally ask, right? So I've had people over the years say, we can redefine what people mean by the word backup, which is a lovely idea, but why don't we go and just ask them instead? So in this year's survey, so this was 1,600 IT leaders who leverage cloud services as part of their overall IT strategy. And so we just asked them straight out, what does BaaS mean to you? Right now, what you're looking at on the slide, by the way, the green line is they could choose all that apply. That's why those lines are longer. And then the three different colors of blues is I chose the last three iterations of this survey. And for each one, they could choose all the greens they wanted, but they could only choose one blue. What's the most important aspect of a backup as a service solution to you? And what you're looking at, so the purplish one, that's the most common, that's the most important for 2024. The middle blue is from 2023. The lightest blue is from 2021. There's a couple things I think we could all agree is part of that universal definition of BaaS, right? So the data will not be in my building, right? I have been saying for 14 years, ever since my first book came out, get your data out of the building, right? It's the first words on chapter 1. It's the last words on the last page. Get your data out of the building. And it used to have to come and hire a guy in a white van to come and lose your tapes for you as your way to get your data out of the building. But that has actually modernized now. But so certainly offsite storage is a clear part. The fact that maybe I don't have to have the backup server or service actually running as an executable within my own environment. Also something that one would presume. The presumption that, hey, if it's running in a cloud, it should be a web-based UI. Those things all seem pretty common. And we've seen that sentiment, those top three, like you would any cloud service, for the last several years. But Leah, I'm going to point you to this top entry. I would point out to you that when the survey first started running back prior to 2021, this was like 6th or 7th on the most important list. And then a couple years ago, it was 4th. And then last year, it was 2nd. This year, it's 1st. The idea that actually delivering that software under that same brand. Now, me personally, I am just as good with Veeam as a cloud as I am with somebody else's cloud powered by Veeam. Right. And I think that's a great way to think about the power between our solution and the solutions delivered by 13,000 amazing service providers. But let's talk about this list. And also, Leah, what does BaaS mean to you?
Oh, man. Well, it's certainly, I think in the last 15 plus years or so, the service to me would be much more in that lower category of operated, monitored, or managed by third-party expert staff. And we're going to talk about where expertise fits in here. But absolutely, the reason you do this sort of year-over-year analysis is to see the trend. And the trend has been bubbling up more and more that organizations are looking for the service to be delivered by that vendor of choice, right? And I mentioned earlier that one of the imperatives that we're seeing is this idea of resiliency and staying ahead of these threat actors. I really think that's part of why we're seeing so many organizations want to go straight to the source, because you're going to be able to use the latest and greatest innovations directly from the provider, managed for you, right? It will be automatically updated for you with the latest best practices. I think that's a really big part of why organizations have been demanding, right? Not just asking, demanding some kind of service to be provided by that actual vendor. And that is, of course, why last year we announced that we were going to be launching a new backup as a service offering called Veeam Data Cloud. So if you haven't had a chance to check out Veeam Data Cloud yet, we've started off with just a few of our offerings, specifically Microsoft 365 and Azure Backup, because this is an Azure-based solution. But this is going to be a great way for you to leverage a continuously versioned as a service offering, and it's going to look and feel exactly like the software you're used to, right? Those UIs and those tools are all there. But the nice thing is it's now slick on a web-based UI. And it's going to be much more wizard-driven, collaborative across your organization. And again, I think that's such a big driver of why organizations are excited to upgrade their primary backup offering because they're seeing so many better options available for their unique needs. And part of that means offloading some or all of this operation to a backup and disaster recovery expert. And in this case, that can be from Veeam, which is really exciting. But again, Jason, we don't want to kind of leave out our partner community as part of this because they are such a big part of making sure that we stay up to date on the latest and greatest trends and that we continue to round out all of the options that are available. Again, if we look at operated, monitored, or managed by third-party expert staff, this is where going with a service provider partner really makes a lot of sense. And while it may not be the most important in 2024 from the survey, it's still ranking very high in that BaaS definition because a lot of these organizations are looking to offload some part of their expertise, their day-to-day management, having someone have their back, having a face of the cloud to call. So that's absolutely a trend that we continue to see in 2024 and expect for years to come.
All right, so let's kind of double click into that. So, and I promise we're going to spend a lot of time because I love our partners. I love the expertise that they bring to this. You know, I appreciate what customers are saying when they say, hey, we'd like that one throat to choke or that one hand to shake. And I like the idea of what does that mean from a technology perspective. But I also have to say I've been in our partner ecosystem for so many years. And one of the things that's always impresses me is when you think about what managed service providers have to do, they have to stand up their own infrastructure and maintain that. They have to provide operational management of the environment. And then they have to really provide what I think is the most compelling part, which is that strategic value add. They understand the environment as well, sometimes more, than their subscribing customers themselves. And so we're going to lean into the expertise side. But before we get into expertise, let's take a look at one of the other data points that comes out of this week. So we talk about BaaS and DRaaS interchangeably, and honestly, they do actually solve slightly different goal sets. So the survey, again, went off and asked 1,600 IT leaders leveraging cloud today. Let's talk about when organizations were asked, why do they use BaaS specifically? Instead of just traditional software and hardware, right? Again, long lines are choose all that apply. Number one, the short lines is what's most important overall. Look, it's a little bit of an eye chart. And if you're watching this on social media where it's a kind of a small screen, let me just kind of distill down the top three elements all come down to what I'm just going to call operational efficiency. It's about removing hardware costs. It's about internal resources. It's about reducing complexity. Leah, you could say those things about the reasons why anyone does any cloud-based service, whether we're talking about cloud-based backup, cloud-based CRM, cloud-based file services, cloud-based databases. Those seem like the reason that you use any cloud. Can I get an amen?
And amen, absolutely. I mean, when we talk with organizations around the world, quite frankly, who have already been adopting cloud solutions, nobody went into this blind. Everybody knew that the cloud is not a charity, right? Yep. But what is becoming top of mind, and in some cases, even above the need to be resilient in the face of a cyber attack, is trying to control cloud costs, right? We oftentimes talk about things like bill shock. And what's interesting from an organizational perspective is when you looked at IT spend 15, 20 years ago, when it was on-premises hardware, capital expenditures, major contracts for implementation, so much of the decision-making or perhaps control of spend came down to procurement. But what we're finding now in Cloudland is that controlling cost in the cloud is much more of a technical imperative than it is some kind of procurement imperative. You can sit down and look at contracts all day long, and that's obviously very important to do. You want to look at things like SLAs, what services are you signing up for? Are you looking at volume-based pricing with things like a MAC agreement, for example, from Microsoft? But so much of your ability to control spend is about the architectural design, the policies you set, because one day you could flip on an API and the next month your bill is double. And that's because simply the reality of the complexity of shared resources, from network management to multiple availability zones to a plethora of infrastructure as a service and platform as a service offerings, it just can get very complicated very easily. And oh, by the way, your credit card's on file. So it's just way too easy to spend that money. So just like Jason said, these kinds of pain points exist regardless of if it's BaaS, DRaaS, IaaS, PaaS, SaaS. There's lots of other as a service acronyms that we could throw in there. Pain points remain. But what's interesting about backup and why cost is so top of mind, it's because we're managing large data sets. So this can be large expenditures, operational expenditures. So finding these efficiencies is so key, especially in backup land. So avoiding costly hardware upgrades and maintenance costs, that's absolutely top of mind when you're thinking about backup as a service. But it's also about freeing up resources, right? If you don't need to manage that server, the networking, that's a really big part of this, offloading some or all of that stack to an expert who knows how to optimize that spend. And then again, reducing the ongoing management and complexity. When you look at someone who is a backup as a service provider, they can very easily figure out, oh, how can we take advantage of deduplication? Do you need to be storing something in immutable storage with a 6-month policy every day? Probably not. Maybe, right? For a workload, you might be able to right-size that. So reducing that ongoing management complexity is going to be a really amazing way to help control those costs and ultimately identify areas for efficiency. And can you do this in-house? Absolutely. But the way that these backup as a service offerings are designed, you can go through some very simple wizard-driven steps. You can use some very simple calculators, and it's amazing how much your total cost of ownership will go down. Can I get an amen now, Jason? Did I preach from the pulpit there?
Preach. And I will say this, I want to make sure folks understand that when we talk about things like the data says avoid costly hardware upgrades, doesn't necessarily mean that you're never going to have a black box with blinky lights still within your environment when you leverage backup as a service. I will tell you some of my favorite managed service providers that leverage Veeam technologies. Part of their service is they drop an appliance on-prem. Right, because from a local speed of recovery, some of the secondary testing and flexibility that you get out of having a local device, a local vault, a local, first tier of recovery, I think is massively powerful from an agility to restore perspective. But you didn't order it, you didn't build it. You didn't assemble the pieces. You didn't patch it. You don't have to manage it. You're paying for an outcome, even if you're still getting all of the wonderful SLA benefits that come out of local metal and disk and or flash and or landing zone or whatever the nuances of your particular on-prem tech might be. So let's not confuse you'll never have metal again with the idea that you'll never have to worry about it again. And that's probably another preachable moment. All right, but so BaaS, when organizations were asked, why do you BaaS instead of just maintaining your own traditional hardware and software, it comes out around operational efficiency. This honestly is my, I have a mug, which I guess is stored offsite someplace. And the mug says, why BaaS when you can DRaaS? Now, that's a little bit oversimplified, but someone caught that from my Twitter feed years ago, and they're still making T-shirts on it. But the idea is when organizations were asked, why do you DRaaS, as opposed to, say, the multi-data center approach? Let's be very, very clear. Veeam loves the multi-data center approach. There's a massive amount of agility that comes out of when you actually own secondary resources. Hopefully you're using them for testing and data mining and data reuse and all kinds of other lovely things, and you're reclaiming the ROI of investments you've already made. That's fantastic, and you should keep doing that. However, what we are seeing more and more is for organizations, maybe they don't have 2 data centers, right? SMBs don't have that option. They should be DRaaSing all day long. For other organizations, their hardware's starting to get a little older. The old stuff may not keep up on the worst day of your business career. So how do we supplement that? That all being said, it's not just about the mechanics and the layout from that. Leah, take a look at the purple lines. They're only purple so we can talk about them separately on the screen. The top three reasons why organizations have chosen to use DRaaS instead of the dual data center model: expertise in BCDR implementation, freeing up resources. That one sounds similar to BaaS. Expertise on planning. I love the fact that, look, you might want to be the smartest person in the room for tactical backups. You probably don't want to be the smartest person in the room when it comes to BCDR planning if you don't have a BCDR planner on staff. And that's what I think this slide is really telling us. And I think the 1,600 folks that took the survey got it right. Leah, what do you think?
Yeah, I think when we look at BaaS, that I can look at that as a day-to-day operation. It's a keeping the lights on function of the team. But when you look at DRaaS, when you really look at the true worst case scenario, it just seems so obvious to engage other experts in this field, because you will have hopefully never experienced whatever you're going to have to face, or maybe you experienced it 10 years ago and you probably did some sort of postmortem, some sort of autopsy to figure out what can we do differently, but that may have been at another company. We recently announced a major acquisition at Veeam for a company called Coveware, right? And one of the really cool things that Coveware does is they actually aggregate a lot of the data about threat actors and study them and learn more about them. That same thing can apply for disaster recovery, right? When you go to a disaster recovery expert, they have collated all of these examples of disasters. They have done those autopsies. They have figured out what went wrong and what could have been in place to improve that example, right? So that's the real value of pulling this expertise. That's why you see it in that biggest purple bar that we got on the page. And again, if you're on social media, you can't see that. Expertise on BCDR implementation and application recovery is that top reason to do DRaaS. And that is such a great benefit, right? Obviously, I think there's a lot of value in freeing up internal IT resources from those day-to-day things. It's hard to get people together for a project plan. It's hard to get people together to do testing on a regular basis, although we will always advise that you do that. Automated testing is great, but you should continue to do testing as part of your environment. But I think being able to offload expertise to an expert when it comes to the worst case scenario, it's a really great opportunity for a lot of organizations.
So I just want to double down again. So I've spent a lot of time with Veeam service providers, and for the longest time it was all of them offered BaaS. An elite percentage of them offered DRaaS. Yep. I will tell you, literally every one of my favorite managed service providers is now offering CRaaS, right? Cyber resiliency as a service. And what they've done is they've taken the DRaaS expertise that they've already gone. And then what they've done is they've actually acquired, many of them have gone off and found cyber VARs, cyber consultants, cyber service providers, whatever, and they're consolidating portfolios. They're literally buying up, kind of like we bought the Coveware folks to give us some intelligence on incident response. But they're buying those folks and folding that DRaaS and that when they're cyber into CRaaS. And I love that, because in many cases, cyber is one kind of disaster. It looks a whole lot like fire and flood and tornado, with the exception of the extra expertise necessary to ensure cleanliness along the way. So there's a massive amount of value that kind of comes out of that. Leah, I feel like we're getting pretty close to time on this. Any last thoughts on this one before we start doing the wrap-ups?
For our next session on BaaS and DRaaS, we're going to be talking a bit about the power of choice. And I'm highlighting that here because Jason made a really great point here. We're seeing as a trend, a lot of our service provider partners have started to pull together expertise, and it's all around those outcomes. So on our next session, I am actually going to be your host. Jason's going to step out, and I'm going to be joined by one of our favorite field folks, Tim Hudson. He works with these service provider partners customers every single day. He knows what's in their book of business, and he knows exactly how to help you guys sort through all of the service provider options that you have available so that you can find a great fit for your organization. So I wanted to tease that because I think as we're kind of wrapping on this topic and talking about expertise, that's something we're going to talk about on the next show too. Anything to add, Jason?
Well, first of all, I just want to point out, I've tried to get Tim Hudson on the Industry Insight show for 4 years that I've been hosting it, and he's always been too busy.
One request from me? No, one request from me and I already got him, so.
Yeah, I've never left a room with Tim that I didn't feel smarter when I left than when I came in. So got to say that officially kind of sucks. Anyway, other than that, I do just want to make a plug for the fact that if any of the data that you've seen here is interesting today, you can hit, so on the Veeam.com website, the Cloud Protection Trends 24 is just published. Earlier this year, the first couple slides we used around the data protection trends published in January. And by the way, every year we're also publishing a ransomware trends, because that's the thing we all have to solve for. That typically comes out in the June time frame. And gosh, we're almost in June again, just saying.
We are.
But there is some fodder for each one of those along the way. So please continue to do that. And if you have questions about any of the data, you can always hit strategicresearch@veeam.com. Email me and I'll tell you everything about how we built it.
Absolutely. Or again, you can join us in person at Veeam. Oh, plug, because that's also what's happening in June. And I know for sure that we are going to be talking a lot about that ransomware trends report that Jason was just teasing. So please be sure to tune in for that. We do this week also have a Tech Bites session. So join us on Thursday for the Tech Bites show. Otherwise, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap here. Thank you so much for joining us on this Tuesday. We look forward to seeing you in the weeks ahead. Thanks again.